to patients, but also to visitors across Wales, and ensuring they don't have huge car parking charges when either receiving treatment or visiting family.
My honourable friend makes an important point, and the NHS in Wales has a good story to tell. I know from my own personal experience of visiting my dad in hospital in recent weeks, the parking provision in Prince Charles Hospital in Merthyr Tydfil and across Wales, having that free provision is important. I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, we must continue to be vigilant to ensure that...
Honourable friend give way. I thank my honourable friend for giving way. And before we leave the list of Welsh firsts, would my honourable friend agree with me that while Wales has pioneered, one of the first nations in Europe, presumed consent for organ donation, which was criticised, I think, by the party opposite, is now being adopted by the party opposite?
I thank again my honourable friend for that intervention. And as I said, there is a very positive story in Wales, and Wales is leading the way in many areas in health. And despite the bluff and bluster we hear from the party opposite, there are many positive attributes to the Welsh NHS. And as I said, we do need to continue to be vigilant to ensure that our NHS is not subject to the vagaries of a Trump-style trade deal with the US. In Wales, the Welsh Labour government has emphatically stated that our NHS is not for sale, and this should be the case right across the UK. I would, Madam Deputy Speaker, like at this point to make a plea for the government to do more to find a solution and a resolution with the NHS and pharmaceutical companies with regards to the Orkambi drug for cystic fibrosis sufferers, including 8-year-old Sophia in my constituency. We do need progress on this issue across the UK, and I appreciate that progress made by this government will apply in England, but I think any attempts to break the deadlock, wherever it is in the UK, will in turn help CF sufferers right across the United Kingdom. Mr Deputy Speaker, we all know that not only health, but other public services generally have been under pressure for a decade due to hard Tory austerity. The Tories are certainly not the party of the NHS as they claim to be, and the neglect shown by the government in the Queen's speech to other areas, including health, social care, mental health, education, is a real cause for concern. The speech was really a missed opportunity by this government to tackle the hardship felt due to continued austerity measures, cuts to things like social care and local government funding, because I think it is important to recognise that local government do have an important role to play in public health and social care, and something that has been significantly underfunded in recent years. We have been promised time and time again that there's an end to austerity, yet there was little in the Queen's speech to give us evidence of the fact that this policy has come to an end. Our local councils are suffering and they are able to provide services that we're aware of, visible services that sometimes people take for granted. But the opportunity to deliver those services is held back by the austerity measures that they're subjected to. This Tory government has starved our local authorities of resources for almost a decade, and although in the early years some councils were able to stretch their budgets to keep some of the vital services going, all that's left to cut now are jobs and services that are closest to the people. And although, Mr Deputy Speaker, local government in Wales is devolved to the Welsh Government, we know that the budget to Wales by this government is some £4 billion less per annum now than it was in 2010, which has had a huge knock-on impact on public services across Wales. And it's wholly wrong that this government must act to show that austerity really is coming to an end. For this government, as they have done in recent weeks, to use the police is a political propaganda tool after almost a decade of slashing budgets and constant cuts to policing and preventative public services, while violent crime has soared and conviction rates have reached record lows, is really shameful. I would, in the closing minutes that I have, Mr Deputy Speaker, like to raise something that wasn't in the Queen's speech. It was an error, in my view, and we're talking about the Queen's speech today, as well as obviously the theme for today, the NHS. One of the the missed opportunities I felt in the speech was that there was no mention whatsoever of the government's plans to put right the cruel injustice felt by women born in the 1950s, and to address the anger that's felt by so many thousands of 1950s women in our country, many of whom would have worked in the NHS, social care and health services. It's more than 2 years now since the last Queen's speech, which also failed to give any mention of this issue, which has already been at that time a huge injustice for too many years. This shows just how long this Tory government has failed to act on this issue. So the government must act to get a fairer deal for the many thousands of 1950s women and bring an end to the shameful legacy of state pension inequality. We all know, including many on the government benches, that this issue will not go away until justice is done. Mr Deputy Speaker, we don't know how long this government has left. Hopefully, for the sake of the country, it's not too long. But it is clear from this Queen's speech that it is a government that's out of touch and out of ideas. Thank you.
Very good. Chris Stevens.
Mr Deputy Speaker, it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Merthyr Tydfil, and I can assure them that I too will be referring to the injustice and the ongoing injustice to 1950s born women. But as it is themed as an NHS debate, I do want to pay particular tribute to all the healthcare staff in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital or the Southern General in the Glasgow South West constituency, and indeed I would want to also say thanks to the healthcare staff at St Thomas's Hospital just over the bridge, because I do know that they do provide healthcare support to members across this House. Now, what a fascinating debate it's been so far, Mr Deputy Speaker. I was particularly interested in the view that we received from Conservative members that austerity is over. I've been getting told that austerity is over in every Queen's speech and every finance bill since I got here in 2015. But I think the best moment was that moment from the Secretary of State, who decided that he was shocked and dismayed that opposition members would not trust the government to privatise the NHS or to make it part of an international trade deal. Now, why would we suggest that? Would it be perhaps, Mr Deputy Speaker, that there are senior members of government whose political inclinations are not too dissimilar to President Trump? Or would it be, well, it's a fact, or would it be that some of them provide, or certainly give away their personalities, as to use that Glaswegian expression, Mr Deputy Speaker, would sell our grannies for a tanner? And I think Democratic Unionists, I will in a moment, as the Democratic Unionist Party are no doubt finding out in the last week. And I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. We do hear frequently about, I think, scaremongering over the privatisation of the NHS, which I think is wrong. We heard this over the TTIP proposals that the EU were trying to negotiate with the United States of America, which were unfounded as well. But does he agree with me that the actual first and only privatisation of an NHS hospital is Hinchinbrook, which was provoked by the Labour Party?
Well, that may very well be the case, but can I say to the Honourable Gentleman, if he thinks that TTIP was scaremongering, I have to say I disagree with him most strongly. It was quite clear that many of us thought that TTIP would have been Thatcherism's ultimate triumph, and I'm glad that TTIP did not take place. But I will be voting for the opposition amendment tonight, because I think that those of us in the House who don't trust the government, who have very real concerns about future trade deals and what that means from the NHS, I think all of us in this House have a responsibility to support that particular amendment. And I'll give way first to my honourable friend.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. I mean, it is the case that Trump cannot change the NHS into an insurance system, but there are at least 19 members on the Conservative benches who have expressed that view at some time in their career. But what he has promised to do is to drive up the drugs bill by at least 2.5 times.
Well, my honourable friend, as usual, makes her case excellently and very well, and there's very few people in this House who could match her in terms of her knowledge of healthcare. And I think the honourable gentleman seems desperate before he falls over. I'll allow him to have an intervention.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. He's been very generous. On the subject of trade deals in the NHS, would he be listening to him? Am I right in thinking that the honourable gentleman therefore believes that the European Union should negotiate trade deals on behalf of this country, and therefore being in a customs union with the European Union is his preferred outcome if Brexit were to happen at all, which I accept is against his party's policy.
Well, I don't want Brexit to happen at all because of my very real fear that health services in this country could very well find its way into a trade deal with the Donald Trumps of the world. Well, the Honourable for Ayr might mumble nonsense, but I have to say to him, many of us have a real fear that that's the case, and we have an opportunity tonight in supporting the opposition amendments. Now, I want to now touch on the pensions bill and following some of the comments from my honourable friend from Merthyr Tydfil, but I do want to perhaps firstly welcome the collective defined contributions pensions that's going to be in that bill. I think that's long overdue. It's something we've discussed in the Select Committee, but it is another example, Mr Deputy Speaker, of trade union pressure and trade union lobbying, and I think that we should congratulate the UCU and the Communication Workers Union, who've campaigned long and hard to ensure that this becomes a reality, the collective defined contributions pensions. And of course, we're now going to see the pension regulator get more increased powers, and I would welcome that too, because we had the situation with Carillion, where the pension regulator was asleep, while Carillion were paying out more in dividends to its shareholders than it was putting in to its pension scheme. And that was the clear evidence that came out in the Carillion inquiry. So I would welcome that too, and I do welcome the move towards pension dashboards, which does increase transparency. But we do go back to the point made by the Honourable Member for Merthyr Tydfil. This scandalous injustice which is not being dealt with. We're talking about women born in the 1950s, growing up, discovering that they can't get access to a chequebook unless they get the permission of their father or their husband, who can't, well, as someone says, I'm not joking, and the reason I'm not joking is because it was 1980 that that law was changed. I would have thought someone sitting on the Minister's bench would know it was a Thatcher government who actually stopped that. And it was the case that women couldn't obtain credit as well without permission from male relatives. Now, they go through that, through their lives, and they then are told at some point that they cannot retire when they thought they were going to retire. Because many women are saying to me that they did not receive correspondence or a letter from the Department of Work and Pensions saying that their retirement age has changed. In fact, I would suggest, in my experience, you're more likely to find someone who's got their 6 numbers than you would have a woman who has received a letter saying that their pension changed. I'll give way to one.
Thank you for honourable member giving way. But would you agree that these women who were born in 1950s are not against the retirement age equality, but they are actually against the way it's been handled by this government?
Well, it's been handled by various governments quite disgracefully, I would say. But it's the opportunity of Parliament now to address that injustice, and it really needs to do so. And it has to, because we're now faced with a sad situation, Mr Deputy Speaker, where women seeking this justice are dying, and that number is increasing on a yearly basis. And I think that we now really do need to address the issue. And one of the reasons we do need to address the issue is we keep getting told a general election is coming. Well, every member of this House should realise that the average number of 1950s born women in each constituency is 5,000 women. 5,000 women, and that's not counting then their relatives and their friends. They have the power to ensure that if this government don't do something about this injustice, that they can vote for other candidates and other political parties who will. Thank you.
There you go.
Thank you. Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's an honour to follow the member for Glasgow South West, who made a passionate speech, especially in respect of the women who were denied their pension rights born in the 1950s. Mr Deputy Speaker, I was disappointed to see only one reference to mental health in the Queen's speech, and even then it was only referring to the Mental Health Act. And I was disappointed to see in the attached background briefing that the government's much vaunted parity of esteem does not stretch to any new funding for mental health services. 1 in 10 children and young people in the UK suffer at some point with mental ill health, and in Birmingham nearly 40% of the population are under 25. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm sure you will be horrified to learn that despite that, for the whole of Birmingham, there is only one early intervention counselling service for young people. Shocking. The most recent count of the counselling service waiting list saw 400 young people waiting for a service. That's 400 young people in desperate need of support who require treatment urgently. That's 400 young people who will have to wait months to see someone. And that's 400 young people and families who in most cases have nowhere else to turn. And this unwillingness to recognise or properly fund vital prevention is yet another example of the Conservative government failing our children and our young people. Mr Deputy Speaker, is the Secretary of State surprised that more and more young people are ending up in A&E when we neglect early intervention care? We need to listen to the growing needs that young people have from young people themselves. The government are not doing this, and that is why I have launched a Young People's Mental Health Working Group, supported by Open Door Counselling, which is a local charity in my constituency, and the Centre for Mental Health. And this group will use their unique perspective to help shape the services they use for the better. Young people have a voice that we need to listen to. So what steps is the government taking to ensure that it works closely with young people with lived experience of mental health when developing future legislative and non-legislative actions related to mental health? Cuts have consequences. Slashing budgets removes safety nets for the most vulnerable in our society and has knock-on effects. I'm sure the Secretary of State knows that excluded students are 10 times more likely to suffer from mental health problems. So what steps is he taking alongside his colleague in the Department for Education to support those students rather than just hanging them out to dry? An inquiry by Birmingham and Solihull Mental Health Trust into 11 deaths found that they were probably avoidable. This is unacceptable, and it is vital that lessons are learned. With one of the highest levels of occupied beds by patients with complex needs, and one of the lowest number of beds per 100,000 coupled with cuts and underinvestment under the Conservatives, what steps is the Secretary of State taking so my constituents will be properly looked after, and that no more families will be forced to go through the pain and heartbreak of being told that a loved one's death was probably avoidable? I would like to briefly touch on the Secretary of State's favourite private healthcare company, or at least the one he talks about the most and publicly endorses, while simultaneously insisting that there will be no more privatisation of the NHS under him. I should also note that the Secretary of State is not alone in his support for Babylon, and as I am sure this House is well aware, the most senior member of the Prime Minister's team advised Babylon as recently as last year. Mr Deputy Speaker, the reason hospitals like the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in my constituency are being forced to take risks in using totally unproven private technical solutions is because they are not receiving sufficient support from this government. The Tories over the past 9 years have stripped the NHS and made it about profit rather than patients. My constituents are rightly worried about the continued growth of companies like Babylon Healthcare as their tentacles in Birmingham reach out beyond GP at hand. And the Secretary of State holds them up as a beacon of light in replacing face-to-face services. But with 94% of enrolled patients under the age of 45, 2/3 of them living in more affluent areas, can he tell me how it will work for my more vulnerable constituents? And can he give answers to the myriad of the other justified concerns from GPs, CCGs and professional bodies? I want to end by paying tribute to the magnificent practitioners and staff who work day in, day out across the various health services that we have. I want to thank those who come from around the world to support us when we need it, whether that is due to mental health problems, physical ailments, old age or any other issue. They deserve to be supported. They deserve to be properly resourced. They deserve to be treated with respect, and they deserve a government that gives them more than empty rhetoric. And I'm sorry that over the last 9 years, under the Coalition and then the Conservative government, they have not been treated in the way that they deserve. Thank you.
Mike Gates.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I want to begin by taking everybody back to the summer of 2012. And Danny Boyle's fantastic ceremony at the end of the Olympic Games. And we had there everybody saying the NHS was our secular religion. And in many senses that is true. And it's been good to have cross-party support from everybody. No one in this House today has challenged the fundamentals of our NHS. But we all know that there is a long-term funding challenge, and because social care is not dealt with by the NHS, but is actually mainly dealt with by local government, we've had the slashing of local government budgets and therefore the crisis in social care. This Queen's speech goes a little way towards addressing the underfunding problems we've got, but we have to be honest. Unless we deal with the social care issue, which is urgent. I went to a conference a week ago, organised by the East London Health and Care Partnership, where one of the speakers pointed out that there have been no less than 9 plans or proposals for having a solution to the social care problem. Yet it's always put in the too difficult box, and so it doesn't happen. It's denounced as a death tax, or it's denounced as a dementia tax. We need grown-up politics, and we've got to deal with that problem. That same conference was bringing together all the NHS bodies in East London. The boroughs of Waltham Forest, Tower Hamlets, Redbridge, Newham, Havering, City and Hackney, Barking and Dagenham. The provider trusts, Barking, Havering, Redbridge, Barts, the Homerton University Hospital, East London NHS Foundation Trust, North East London NHS Foundation Trust. And those clinical commissioning groups that I've listed also reflected by the local authorities that are there. But there is no integration. My borough, Redbridge, has integrated care with the North East London Foundation Trust. And they do good work in a joined-up way. But each borough does different things. The NHS institutions do different things. Now, we've had some criticism here of what people have done in the past. I want to criticise the Labour government for its PFI, and that has been a major problem of the costs at Barking, Havering and Redbridge Trust because of the PFI at Queen's Hospital. I also want to criticise the fact that we weren't allowed to take the Intermediate Care Centre at King George Hospital back into the NHS because there was a company that took the NHS to court and won the legal challenge. But I also want to criticise, and that's why I'm going to vote for the opposition's amendment tonight, the fragmentation of the NHS brought in by the Lansley Health and Social Care Act of the Liberal Democrats, and don't forget it, and the Conservatives. And I have to say, if we're all doing mea culpas, we need to be honest rather than trying to score points today. What we are seeing in North East London, is a move back towards integration away from what Lansley proposed. Now, I've been here 27 years. I've seen all this stuff before. When I came in, there was a FHSA, a Family Health Service Authority. There was then a trust model where I had an integrated trust with mental health and acute in the same trust. And then it was divided. And then there was further divisions and further fragmentation. Then it's reorganised back again. Very costly, very expensive, and you get the rotation of individuals, and the member from Scotland, from Ayrshire, I think, referred to it earlier. People getting paid huge amounts in redundancy payments and then reinventing themselves and coming back in another NHS organisation. This can't go on. It's really ridiculous, and the public don't understand the terms. People come to you as a constituency MP about an NHS issue. They don't know what a CCG is. They have no idea how to make a complaint through the system. MPs are acting as gatekeepers and advocates for our constituents to try and go through this minefield. And when they say they're going to have a consultation, well, most of the consultations are predetermined shams. I've led a campaign to save the A&E in my constituency. We started, myself and the then member for Ilford North, Lee Scott, we joined together with a local paper. And then the current member for Ilford North also was with me over more recent years. It took from 2006 until July this year, when the member for Wimbledon, in a parliamentary answer to me, confirmed that the A&E at King George Hospital is saved, and that is in the draft response to the NHS plan. That is a fantastic victory for our community, but why did it have to take so long?
Matt Robert.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in this important debate. With a rising number of patients, particularly frail elderly people, the cost of treatment increasing, and also, very importantly, the severe lack of funding, our much-loved health service is under truly severe pressure. I would like to pay tribute to NHS staff for the vital work they do, despite that enormous pressure, and I very much would like to record my appreciation for them tonight. Mr Deputy Speaker, I would like to address three issues. First of all, the scale of the challenge in health. Secondly, the government's damaging approach. And thirdly, and finally, the need for real change. It is no exaggeration to say that the scale of the challenge facing our health service is quite simply enormous. And this is partly because of the considerable changes taking place as our population gets older and people live longer. And I should say that it is a very good thing that life expectancy is increasing, and it's something which we are all obviously grateful for. However, a growing number of frail older people do need appropriate care and support, and that care must be properly funded. In addition, medical science is obviously advancing, and advancing very rapidly, and that's offering wonderful new and life-changing treatments. But again, those new treatments need to be supported by the necessary level of funding. I should add that there are also additional local challenges in some parts of the country. So, for example, in my constituency of Reading East, we face particularly intense pressure in terms of staff recruitment and retention because of the high cost of housing, and also as more people move into our part of the Thames Valley. So to give you a brief outline of that particular issue, we face higher than average living costs for NHS staff in our area, arguably similar costs to people living in outer London, but with no London waiting. And this is an important point about resources, which I do want to return to later. Secondly, of my three key points, I'm afraid the government is quite simply failing to respond to the scale of the challenge. Ministers today have offered warm words, while fundamentally they're failing to provide the necessary investment. My right honourable friend, the member for Leicester South, is absolutely right when he talks about the crisis in the NHS and the fact that every single measure of NHS performance is going the wrong way. So, for example, in my seat, A&E waits have risen dramatically, and just looking at A&E waits of over 12 hours, so not even going into the 4-hour target, over 12 hours. In the Royal Berkshire Hospital, these have increased by around 5 times in 1 year. So the latest recorded figures, that's a comparison from 2016-17 to 2017-18. And of course, conveniently for the government, ministers have decided to move the target rather than measuring it. Yep. We've also lost 2 GP surgeries, and that is the tip of a very big iceberg in primary care in our area and across the country. These are GPs where the GPs are retiring, and there's a lack of new GPs coming on stream to replace them. Now, in one case, local residents have had to move to a GP surgery in a different county, several miles away. Others have had to move to surgeries across our town. And for frail elderly people, that could involve a change of bus routes, difficulties getting to see their GP, and considerable additional problems in accessing primary care. On top of that, many other services are under enormous pressure, and to make things even worse, there's a deeply damaging privatisation agenda, which I heard about from my colleague, the member for Oxford East, which also affects Reading and many other neighbouring towns within our area. And to make matters even worse than that, we have the ridiculous situation where the government's pressing ahead with a hard Brexit, or something that resembles it very closely, which is driving away highly skilled NHS staff. Around 14% of the staff at my local hospital are from the EU. Can you imagine how difficult recruitment could be in a very short space of time? So, Mr. Speaker, finally, we do need real change. And real change, in my view, means significant long-term increases in investment, not just warm words and playing with statistics that create a misleading impression about the level of funding. If the government really believes in the NHS, it needs to demonstrate it with its actions through policy choices, rather than just giving vague promises which it's unlikely to deliver. I'm afraid I'm pushed for time. Other members have already highlighted many of the changes needed, but I do want to pick up on a few crucial points. First and foremost, I believe that the NHS needs to respond to the issues and needs of patients and staff on the ground, not just to spout changes which sound convincing in terms of management jargon. And this, in my view, means a much greater focus from ministers and officials on the needs of local communities. So in high-cost areas like Berkshire, it means looking at new measures to support recruitment and retention, including the cost of living. And I believe ministers should consider proposals for increasing pay overall within the 3 counties in the Thames Valley, with increased weighting for other high-cost areas to help recruit and retain staff in towns like Reading and Woodley. So to sum up, the NHS remains one of our most precious institutions. Staff are obviously working tirelessly in very difficult and trying situations. Yet their dedication is not being matched remotely by government funding, and what is needed now is a complete and utter rethink of government health policy. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we need real change, and only Labour will deliver that change. That's the funding and support we desperately need for our NHS. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's an honour to follow my honourable friend for Reading East. And having listened to much of this debate, it's clear that the NHS is a treasured institution under threat from a hard Tory Brexit, and a Labour government is the only way to secure its future and keep it wholly in public hands. But today I want to speak about a specific issue that I have been involved in since I've been elected in 2017. When I was approached by families in my constituency about getting access to medical cannabis, a medicine that could change the lives of children living with intractable epilepsy, I really couldn't understand what the problem was until I spoke to my late friend Paul Flynn, who I know had done a lot of work on this issue, and he explained how it has been an uphill struggle.
Thank my honourable friend. It was remiss of me earlier in the debate not to pay tribute to the leadership she has shown on this campaign, as well as the honourable member from Hemel Hempstead. She brought a group of campaigners to see me earlier in the year, and I just wanted to put on record our thanks for the tremendous work that she's putting into this campaign as well.
I thank my honourable friend for that contribution, and thank you. I look forward to keep on working with you. So, it's an uphill struggle, that's what it's been, and whilst thousands of people across the world have access to medicinal cannabis, the law was preventing patients in the UK from accessing it. So we got to work with the amazing families through our End Our Pain campaign, spearheaded by the amazing Hannah Deacon, mum to Alfie Dingley. Now, Hannah's campaigning meant that she got a special licence for Alfie to continue to use the cannabis that had transformed his life in the Netherlands. Then Sophia Gibson and Billy Caldwell were also given prescriptions for medical cannabis. And the highlight last year was when there was a change in the law to reclassify cannabis on the 1st of November 2018 so that it was available for medical use. And we thought at the time that it would mean that the children suffering would be able to have cannabis prescribed by specialist consultants. But it turned out that this wasn't actually the case. So many other children were not given access to this life-changing medicine. Children from all over the UK are continuing to suffer because this government are dragging their feet. It is proven to work for so many different types of sufferers, and these children are still being pumped full of steroids and unlicensed drugs which leave them severely impaired. The effect on the families has been terrible, on the children, on the siblings and the parents. And it's just not fair. Now, no one claims that this is a miracle drug. This is not a cure for epilepsy, but it does make a huge difference to the quality of these children's lives. And everyone has a right to live their best life. And I've worked closely with the parents of Bailey Williams from Cardiff, Rachel and Craig. I've seen firsthand the difference this medicine has made to their son. In fact, I called at their house one evening and Bailey got out of the chair and went to pick a bunch of flowers up and brought them to me. And I actually cried to see a child that couldn't get out of bed, get up out of a chair and give me a gift of thanks. And a lot of the others have the same story. Alfie has been riding a bike, a horse, something that would never have happened when he was on his previous drugs. But the problem now is that Alfie is getting to a point where his efficacy for this particular type of medicinal cannabis is dulling. And as with all long-term medication, he needs a review and to be put on a new strain. But the strict restrictions mean that even Alfie won't be able to access a new strain. And as his tolerance to his current medication builds, he is beginning to have more seizures. So, what next for Alfie, and what will the Secretary of State do? And as we approach the anniversary of the law change, I want to reflect on what's happened to the lives of the families I have worked with the Right Honourable Member for Hemel Hempstead as the co-chair of the APPG on medicinal cannabis. The End Our Pain campaign on the 19th of March, the Secretary of State told these families he would make sure that they got the medicine they need. But over 6 months on from that promise, and nearly a year later from the law change, not one new NHS prescription has been made. Not one child benefiting from medical cannabis. Not one family who can move on with their lives. And we know that NHS doctors, I will give way, but I won't take the time.
Indeed, and it can show this House how people from different parties, Mr Deputy Speaker, with very diverse views on politics, can work together for the better good of children. What I say to my honourable friend is there are children that are getting medical cannabis on prescription, but somehow they're paying for it. Their parents are paying for it, their grandparents are paying for it, and NHS is free at the point of delivery. That's what it should be, surely.
Agree with the Right Honourable Gentleman. Now, I made a personal choice to go to the Netherlands with some of the parents to pick up the cannabis they need for their children. Parents like Emma Appleby, who has a prescription for her daughter, Tegan, costing thousands of pounds. But who can afford to fly to the Netherlands to get their prescriptions? Because it's less over there than it actually is here. And this is a two-tier system that has been created by the government. Parents are forced to fundraise for medicine. One mother has put her house up for sale to pay for the next round of drugs. Now, these families have run out of time, they've run out of money, and they've run out of patience. All 20 families will hunger strike because they are at the end of the line. I'm going to move swiftly on because on the 19th of September, 6 months after the Secretary of State had made his promises, the families are continuing to fight for their kids. They took a bill to the Secretary of State showing the money they have spent on their private prescriptions for this medicine, delivering letters to the Prime Minister, begging him to do something. They've been ignored. They have not had a response. And this is absolutely disgraceful. These families are being pushed to the end of their tether, and I honestly believe it is time for the Secretary of State to either reconsider his position or get it sorted. And as a mother, if I was faced with this inaction, I would be fighting to get these life-saving drugs from the NHS free. I would be doing everything I could, and that is why I will continue to do everything I can to help these children who are needlessly suffering. And I will raise this at every opportunity, and I won't stop until we have the good news that we need.
Mr Deputy Speaker, at the opening of the London Olympics, Danny Boyle wanted to show the world what it meant to be British. And he chose the NHS because it illustrates all that is best in our country. On TV, millions marvelled at our nurses, our doctors, our carers. In the stadium, thousands cheered. That's how proud we are of our NHS. All the people who work in it, cleaners, consultants, nurses, night porters, radiographers, receptionists, they all play a vital role in caring for our society. They are our national symbol of community and our model of selfless service. And this debate has reflected that. 34 speeches, 49 interventions, some wonderful speeches, personal testimonies. The member for Old Bexley and Sidcup, the member for Dudley South, and my dear friend from North Tyneside, who I think, if she didn't quite move herself to tears, certainly moved the rest of us. But millions now worry that the NHS could be up for grabs in a future free trade agreement. At the heart of those fears is the 2012 Health and Social Care Act, passed by the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition. It put cost before quality and commercial competition at the heart of health commissioning. Just after the Act was passed in Brent North, our local 111 service was outsourced to a private company, the majority of whose directors sat on the very local clinical commissioning group that had awarded them the contract. The Health and Social Care Act has allowed perverse commissioning decisions like this up and down the country. Today, our local CCG in northwest London faces not the £51 million deficit at year-end set out in their operation plan, but £112 million. An additional £61 million overspend as a result of an increase in acute activity of 18% against a population increase of 5%. So when members opposite and their Liberal Democrat partners tell us that the NHS was not for sale, those assurances were worthless. You may not be able to buy it, but privatisation is tearing it apart. And my CCG has announced the closure of the 24-hour service at the urgent care centre in Middlesex Hospital. I can't because of time. It's this legislation that now exposes our NHS to foreign competition and undermines our public healthcare system. It is Donald's door into our NHS. 170,000 people already know this, and they've signed a parliamentary e-petition calling on this government to introduce safeguards that will protect it from new trade deals. Trade agreements lock in privatisation. They open up access to foreign investors and speculators. That's why we need safeguards. Very briefly.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Does he agree with me that one of the great threats to our NHS is a trade deal with the US, which, as happened in Australia 10 years ago, that drove up the price of medicine significantly?
I do agree with him. Look, Mr. Deputy Speaker, in 2007, Slovakia wanted to move from a private health system, modelled on the USA, to a system more like ours. Slovakia were sued for millions of euros by a Dutch company who thought this might affect their future profits. That's because trade deals often contain clauses that give foreign investors the right to sue governments for decisions that may impact their profits. These investor-state dispute settlements, or ISDS clauses, are common in modern free trade agreements. Policy decisions like legislating for the plain packaging of cigarettes have all been subjected to these ISDS claims. Labour believes that the UK should be free to make public health policy based upon the health needs of the British people. We should not have to bend to some company that is profiting from keeping our people ill, whether that's from tobacco or polluted air or too much sugar. There are over 750 known such cases that have been brought under ISDS clauses in other countries. More than half resulted in compensation for the foreign investors or financial settlements out of court. So Labour will not sign up to any free trade agreement that uses these ISDS-style rules. They're wrong in principle, and even where they're not used, they can lead to regulatory chill. Incredibly, the right to sue the government under these ISDS clauses does not extend to our own UK companies, only to foreign ones in their own separate private courts. But Labour has confidence in our courts and thinks foreign companies should have no greater rights of redress than British companies. Free trade agreements also typically include market access clauses and national treatment provisions. These set out the extent to which overseas businesses can operate in our markets. They insist that we afford at least the same treatment to foreign as we would our own businesses. In the past, that's been done by listing all those services which had been agreed. If a service in the NHS was not on the list, then it could not be the subject of foreign competition. Agreements used to set out only those services which we were prepared to open up to competition. But modern trade agreements don't work this way. Instead, they adopt a negative list system. This says every service is opened up to competition unless it is placed on the negative list. Anything missed off is automatically open to competition. Once missed, it can't ever be put back on the list. And any new service that comes as a result of technological or scientific breakthrough which wasn't on the list is automatically open for foreign competition. Imagine that we'd agreed this negative list before the age of the internet, before digital technology had changed the way that patients could be screened and tested. If we lose our own capacity and skill to provide these services directly, we become a captive market and vulnerable to the abuse of private monopoly and spiralling costs. Governments can't intervene where there's been a clear future, even where there's been a clear failure in the sector or patient health has been compromised. We need legal guarantees that no such negative list trade agreement will be concluded. That's why members on this side of the House have sought to introduce measures into the trade bill to achieve this protection. Members opposite voted it down, every single one. And when their lordships in another place secured essential provisions for proper scrutiny of trade agreements and a defined parliamentary procedure for ratification, what did the government do? They abandoned the bill entirely. Now they want to bring it back to the same legislation, but without those safeguards. A potential deal with the US is of major concern to those who care about our health service. The American model is renowned for its pursuit of profit and indifference to the poor. The US ambassador told national TV that the NHS would be on the table, and the US had already looked at all the components of the deal. President Trump confirmed it. The Office of the US Trade Representative has published its list of negotiating objectives for any such deal. One is to stop the NHS using its bulk purchasing power to negotiate lower drug prices. The US Secretary of Health and Human Services actually said the US would, and I quote, pressure other countries through trade negotiations so Americans pay less and we pay more. The USA wants to stop the UK regulating the pharmaceutical industry unless the US industry has agreed. So much for taking back control. In one of their first acts, after establishing the Department for International Trade, this government opened 3 new offices in the US, in Raleigh, in Minneapolis, and in San Diego. Biopharma hubs where major healthcare providers, biotech pharmaceutical manufacturers, and health insurers are headquartered. What was it about those cities that was so attractive, if not to attract players from those sectors into our NHS? The Labour Party created the NHS. We will not allow this government's trade agreements to damage it. Under Labour, it will remain a universal service, free at the point of use, based on medical need, not ability to pay.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is a privilege to wind up this important debate on behalf of the Government, particularly in the light of the many excellent measured contributions by members of both sides of the House. It's also a pleasure to be responding to a debate in which the Shadow Secretary of State for Health and the Shadow Secretary of State for Trade have spoken. I have great regard for them both, although unlike the Shadow Secretary of State for Trade, I intend to focus rather more on health and the NHS, given that is what this debate is about. That this debate has been so well attended reflects the importance of and pride in the NHS felt by all members and our constituents, and indeed by the government and opposition alike. The NHS rightly occupies a special place for all of us. and it is an opportunity for me standing here to pay tribute to all who work in our NHS. Now, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, in a marathon speech opening this debate, set out the 5 major reforms in the Queen's speech that place health and social care at the heart of that speech. Our long-term plan, the Medicines and Medical Devices Bill, the HSIB Bill, Adult Social Care Reform and the Mental Health Act reform. Measures that come on top of record investment by this government in our NHS. £33.9 billion extra through the long-term plan. 40 new hospitals being built with 6 ready to go now. More doctors. A real commitment to ensuring our NHS is fit for the future. Now, before turning to the opposition's amendment, I would seek to touch on as many of the points made by honourable and right honourable members as I can. I would start by mentioning the incredibly moving, powerful and brave speeches by the members, my right honourable friend, the member for Old Bexley and Sidcup, for Dudley South, the honourable lady, the member for North Tyneside, and the honourable lady, the member for Kynon Valley. They all rightly paid tribute to the NHS and set out their personal debt to the NHS. And I think it is right that on behalf of this House and the government, I echo that tribute, because it is thanks to that amazing NHS that those 4 wonderful colleagues are still with us, and we should be extremely grateful for that. I would highlight the contributions by my right honourable friends, the members for Ludlow and Wimbledon, both extremely distinguished predecessors of mine in this role. I think if I manage to stay for another week in this role, I will have passed the tenure of my predecessor, but I have a long way to go before serving as long as my 2 right honourable friends, and I pay tribute to them for their commitment to the NHS, for all they did for it in that role, and for their central role in putting the building blocks in place for the long-term plan, the investment we are able to announce today. I would touch then on the contribution by the honourable lady, the member for Totnes, who in a typically measured, well-informed and reasonable speech highlighted the importance of listening, to partnership and to engaging. In the context of the long-term plan, she's absolutely right to highlight that we are listening to the NHS, and they in turn have listened to the public and, of course, as we all do, to her committee. I have yet to be summoned before it, but I suspect that may be only a matter of time. My honourable friend, the member for South West Bedfordshire, made an important speech in which he highlighted the importance of workforce and medical schools and the new places. And I am very pleased that this government has set up 5 new medical schools. I had the privilege of visiting the new medical school on the first day for the students in Lincoln, something that has stemmed from a campaign led by our former colleague, the former member for Lincoln, Carl McCartney, who campaigned passionately for that, and it was a privilege to meet those students on their first day. The right honourable member for Westmoreland and Lonsdale touched on radiotherapy. It is an issue which I know he takes a particular interest in. The honourable member for Easington has already raised this with me privately, and as I've said to the honourable member for Easington, I'm very, very happy to meet both of them to discuss it further if that is helpful. Honourable member for Harborough, my honourable friend and my neighbour, spoke positively and passionately about the impact the investment we are putting in to our local hospital trust in Leicester will have on our constituents. The honourable member opposite, the Shadow Secretary of State, his constituents, I'm sure, will be just as pleased as ours are, and I hope that he might evince a certain degree of positivity about it. I turn now to the honourable lady, and I may get a constituency wrong, for East Kilbride, Strathavon and Lesmagog. Almost. I thank her very much for her tone, which again emphasised the need for us to be measured in our language in this debate. There will always be political passions and differences, but it is right we seek to be measured. She also mentioned thalidomide and her work, I think, around this, which I believe my honourable friend, the member for North Dorset, has also been very much involved in. Again, with the appropriate minister, I'm very, very happy to meet her to discuss that. We heard powerful speeches from many colleagues on both sides of the House advocating for their constituents, which is as it should be. Telford, Hemel Hempstead, the Wrekin and Hartlepool, and indeed the honourable gentleman member for Nottingham North, highlighting the importance of social care, as did so many other members, and it's absolutely right we focus on that. Now, turning to the Shadow Minister and the opposition amendment. I say once again to this House, because repetition is never a sin in this place, as my right honourable friends, the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State, have set out clearly, our NHS is not for sale. Yeah. Our NHS has never been for sale, and our NHS will never be for sale, and no trade agreement will ever change this. Our NHS is not on the table in any trade talks. Now, as my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, set out, the opposition front bench knowingly push this scaremongering nonsense. They push it because they don't want to talk about Brexit, given their non-policy in this area, characterised by dither, delay and dodge. And given that position, I don't blame them for not wanting to talk about it, but they should know better than to seek to scare vulnerable people with talk of things that are not going to happen. Mr. Speaker, the opposition may speak about their commitment to the NHS, but the difference is that we on this side actually deliver on our commitments. The longest and largest cash settlement in the history of the NHS. The biggest and boldest hospital building programme in a generation. New treatments, new technologies to deliver world-class and cutting-edge care. And addressing the injustices in social care and inequalities in mental health. Mr. Speaker, it is clear the Conservatives are the real party of the NHS. We have protected and prioritised the NHS for each of the 44 years of its 71-year history when we have been in government. And under this government and this Prime Minister, we will continue to do so, helping our doctors and nurses do their jobs, putting the NHS on a secure and stable footing for the future. A publicly funded NHS, free at the point of use, accessible according to need, not ability to pay, so that our NHS can continue to be there for every...
Point of order. To move that the question be now put. The question is that the question now put. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is that the amendment be made. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary no. No. Division. Clear the lobbies. Order. The question is that the amendment be made. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary no. No. Tell us for the ayes Jeff Smith and Bambastora Lombas, and for the noes Nigel Huddleston. Welcome to your place, and David Rutley.
Lock the doors!
Order.
The ayes to the right, 282. The noes to the left, 310.
Where were the Lib Dems? Where were the Lib Dems?
Lib Dems.
Thanks. The ayes to the right, 282. The noes to the left, 310. The noes have it, the noes have it. Unlocked. Point of order, Sarah Wollaston.
Deputy Speaker, I'm frankly astonished that at such short notice the Prime Minister has sent a note to the Liaison Committee refusing to appear before us in the morning. This is the only committee that can call the Prime Minister to account, and it allows us to ask detailed questions with follow-up on behalf of the public. This is now the third occasion on which the Prime Minister has cancelled. Could I seek your guidance, Mr Deputy Speaker, because I think this is entirely unacceptable.
Well, it might be nice if I could answer it, and then we can have a further point of order. What I would say is, look, 3 times is very difficult, and quite rightly, you have to hold all officers and even the Prime Minister to account. I recognise that. What I would say is, I do also recognise it's very difficult times at the moment, and I would hope that it has been listened to by the front bench here, and I'm hoping that immediately we can come forward with the date for the Prime Minister, but more importantly, that the liaison panel can get that meeting in. And as Chair, I recognise the need to do so. So I've got to say both ways, there is a need to try and make sure we can make this happen. Further point of order, Sir Patrick.
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, as a member of the Liaison Committee as well, of course the Liaison Committee is disappointed that the Prime Minister is unable to appear before it tomorrow. But the truth of the matter is, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister is held to account in this chamber by all members of Parliament every week for over an hour. And as far as people not being held to account, it is simply not true of the Prime Minister.
I can see tensions are running high. I've given a very honest answer. I think that it's fair to both sides. But coming in a minute, Cooper.
Mr Deputy Speaker, as the Chair of the Liaison Committee has said, this is now the 3rd time. The very purpose of having the Liaison Committee is to be able to take more detailed evidence and to scrutinise the Prime Minister in a more detailed way. The Prime Minister has said he does not want to come now till 5 or 6 months after his initial appointment. That means December or January. At such a time when there are so many important decisions to be made for the country, surely it is utterly irresponsible for the Prime Minister to refuse to answer detailed scrutiny questions from the committee. And if he has done this 3 times before, how on earth can we have any confidence in a December or January date either?
Well, can I say, if we can get to January and February, it's more than I'm expecting at the moment. What I would say is, I hope the message has gone out. 3 times the frustration, quite rightly, is there. What I would say, I don't know the reason for tomorrow, but I do know we're at very serious and dangerous times in the future of this present Parliament. What I would say is, I'm sure, as I said earlier, that message will go back, and I would like to think at the earliest possible date that can be put in sooner rather than later, this year, not next year, unless other events overtake us. Steve Baker.
Deputy Speaker, on a point of order, could you advise me if there's any way that we could highlight in this House the profound injustice that some members are able to achieve high office in the committee system by virtue of their party affiliation, and yet they continue to hold that high office after they've abandoned their party?
Very good point. Can I just say, I'm not going to get into that argument. I have enough on my plate without going down that road. Mary Craig, just let's go through the other stuff. Mary Craig.
I do think that that last comment was unworthy of the honourable gentleman. Can I just say that we were told by the Prime Minister the first date was eventually, he got out of the first date by, I believe, proroguing Parliament, and clearly the programming of the business for this week, which would have seen us in report stage on the Brexit with the withdrawal agreement bill, would have meant the Prime Minister, quite rightly, would have had to have been in the chamber. Is it in order for the Prime Minister to sort of use the liaison committee, use smoke and mirrors to kind of pretend he's coming to the liaison committee and then always find a way to wriggle out the back door and never actually be accountable?
I'm going to say, I'm not going to enter into speculation. What I am going to say is I've been very clear. I have made the point. I am not going to change anymore. Simval Hotter.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Further to some of the comments made, could I seek your advice, Mr Speaker, about the accountability of the Prime Minister, because truly he is accountable to the Liaison Committee as well as to the House and in other matters.
And I've been down that already. I'm not going to change more than what I've said. Dr. Sarah Willis.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Further to the point of order from the honourable gentleman opposite, could I seek your confirmation that select committee chairs are elected by the whole House of Commons because they are trusted not to take a tribal party political viewpoint in their role as select committee chairs?
Yes. Right. Let us now begin to move on. We now come to motion... sorry. Oh, sorry. Dr. Philippou. Come on.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I can't jump up and down like other people can. But I would like to make a point of order in response to my question this morning about compensation for the victims of the contaminated blood scandal. The Minister for the Cabinet Office suggested the government are waiting for, and I quote, the determination of liability to which the inquiry's determinations relate. But surely he must recognise that under the 2005 Act, a public inquiry cannot determine liability. So how can I call for the Minister for the Cabinet Office to correct the answer that he gave?
Hear, hear. You've done it for me. The Treasury bench has heard. Thank you for that. Right, let's begin to move on. We now come to motions. I'd like to put 2 and 3 together. Minister to move. Beg to move. That's great. Excellent. The question is, as on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to the adjournment debate. I just need to read this out first. Bear with me. If I can see, it'll be even better. Small type from the clerks and everything. Before I call the right honourable member, Helton, Price and Howden, I should inform the House that I've been advised that the matter of deletion or otherwise of data obtained by the Police Service of Northern Ireland for the so-called Lochin Island journalist is before the courts, with a hearing date set for next month. Therefore, those specific legal proceedings are sub judice. Under the terms of the House's resolution, and therefore references should not be made to the merits or otherwise of that matter. I thank the Right Honourable Member for his courtesy in consulting with the Speaker's Office in advance of this debate, and I remind any other member participating in this debate to be equally mindful of the sub judice resolution on matters still before the courts. Right Honourable David Davis.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. You're right, I provided a copy of this speech.
You want to move the motion?
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is this House do now adjourn. David Davis.
Mr Deputy Speaker, you're right, I have provided a copy of what I've got to say, and I will stick to it religiously throughout the debate. And can I start also by commiserating with the Minister who has to answer me. He seems to be the Minister for receiving hospital passes from me in the last few months, one way and another. However, the issue today is very serious. 25 years ago, on the 18th of June 1994, a crowd of locals gathered in O'Toole's pub in Lochin Island in County Down in Northern Ireland to watch the Republic of Ireland play Italy in the World Cup. Shortly after Ireland scored the winning goal, 2 members of the Ulster Volunteer Force burst into the pub with automatic assault rifles and sprayed bullets across the bar. 6 people were murdered and 5 more badly injured in this brutal and sectarian attack by loyalist paramilitaries. These people were targeted because they were Catholic. It's known as the Lochin Island Massacre, and it's gone down as one of the darkest moments in the Northern Irish Troubles. It was an atrocity that shocked even those who lived amongst sectarian violence day in and day out. At the time, it was described by the media as brutal, inhuman, barbaric, callous slaughter, and it was worldwide news. The families of the victims received condolence letters from the Queen and from the Pope. But the Royal Ulster Constabulary's investigation was marked by a litany of missed opportunities to gather and examine evidence. The morning after the shooting, the police found the getaway car abandoned in a field in the nearby town of Ballynahinch, but they failed to properly examine the field. They left the car wide open to the elements before it could be fully examined, and they destroyed the car only 10 months later. Then there were the murder weapons, also found in another field only 10 miles from O'Toole's bar. The police recovered ample DNA evidence from the rifles, but failed to follow it up on investigation. The police also had informants embedded in the UVF who were involved in the procurement and distribution of arms. But again, the police failed to follow up. The investigation was such a failure that it prompted the victims' families to call for the Ombudsman to look into it in 2006. In his damning report, the Ombudsman concluded, I quote, corrupt relationships existed between members of security forces in Southdown and the UVF unit, to whom police attributed the murders at Loughin Island. The failure by police to investigate the veracity of intelligence is that those responsible have been warned by a police officer of their imminent arrest is inexcusable. So it's clear this investigation was a case of both incompetence and collusion. Those responsible for this heinous crime have never been arrested, charged or prosecuted. The member for Strangford, I give way.
Mr Deputy Speaker, thank you for giving me the chance to intervene and following your line of thought. I appreciate the member takes a very special interest in journalistic freedom and civil liberties. Could I, as I've given a copy and shown this before, could I respectfully direct them to work of another journalist, Mark Rainey, writing in the Belfast newsletter. Mr Rainey ran a very most illuminating series of articles about the officers involved in the investigation of the very wicked and heinous murders at Loughin Island. He said, and this is quoted in the paper, he wrote the following: almost all of the original concerns about the actions of police which helped spark the fresh Ombudsman investigation in 2012 have now been dismissed as bogus or unjustified, including the erroneous identification of the alleged getaway driver claimed to be a police agent.
As well as my interest in press freedom, I share with the honourable gentleman a long-standing interest in the affairs of Northern Ireland throughout the whole course of the Troubles, as he well knows, and I will take this opportunity, Mr Deputy Speaker, to pay tribute to his gallant service in the UDR, if I remember correctly, right at the height of the Troubles and the difficult times. So we are in the same place on this, and I'll say this about what I've been saying today. I hold the original RUC and now the PSNI in the greatest of respect. The vast majority of the officers serving in those forces are brave, all of them are brave, and the vast majority absolutely determined to see justice delivered. But on this occasion, there is a different view put by the Ombudsman, and I think I have to treat that as the overriding judgment. And I'll say this. This is not actually the main point I want to make today, it comes later, but I will say this, that I would urge the government and the PSNI to reopen the original investigation to Loughin Island and make sure that it's done to everybody's satisfaction this time. Now, 13 years on from the brutal assault, two Northern Irish journalists, Barry McCaffrey and Trevor Burney, exposed the truth. In a remarkably hard-hitting documentary called No Stone Unturned, released in September 2017, they told the story of the victims of the massacre and their families, and they shone a light on collusion and incompetence at the heart of the investigation, and they named those suspected of being responsible. Now, like countless journalists have done over the years, they got their information from an anonymous leak. In a plain, unmarked envelope, Barry McCaffrey was anonymously sent an unredacted police ombudsman report, naming the suspects and detailing the evidence behind the allegation of police cover-up. It found collusion between the Royal Ulster Constabulary and the Ulster Volunteer Force. It found incompetence, it found a cover-up of the true events, and for the first time, it named those who the police believed to be responsible for the brutal murders. What started as a hard-hitting documentary on a huge event in Irish history would now become a dramatic exposé of the failure of policing. It was, of course, an investigative journalist's dream leak. But even so, during the film's pre-publication and editing process, the journalists offered the named suspects a right of reply, which was not taken up. They also informed the Ombudsman of the suspects the film would name. The Ombudsman passed that information onto the PSNI. They wanted to be sure the PSNI was informed in case there was any reason for the safety of the suspects or in case the police had any other compelling reason why the film should not be released. They received no response. When the documentary was released in 2017, it was well regarded by both communities in Northern Ireland. And in July 2019, it was nominated for an Emmy in the Outstanding Investigative Documentary category. But a year after it was broadcast, Barry McCaffrey and Trevor Burney were arrested on extraordinary charges by the police service in Northern Ireland. For simply doing their jobs, they were arrested and charged with suspected theft, handling stolen goods, breaches of the Official Secrets Act, and breaches of data protection rules. And the PSNI's action was extraordinarily heavy-handed. Some 100 armed officers turned up at their homes at 7 in the morning while the families were eating breakfast. And the police arrested the journalists in front of their wives and children. Then the police searched the homes and offices and seized their phones, laptops and hard drives. They even seized the phones of Barry and Trevor's children. Now the police hold a huge amount of very personal data belonging to these journalists and their families. Imagine if the same had happened to the journalists who published leaks from the National Security Council on the Chinese involvement in the 5G network, an issue that really did have an impact on national security, or the leaked diplomatic telegrams from Sir Kim Darroch, or the leaked Yellowhammer documents last month. There would rightly have been a national uproar. All of these leaks were uncomfortable for the state, but that's precisely what journalism is for, to hold those in power and authority to account and to force them to answer for their decisions. Barry McCaffrey and Trevor Burney had the courage to challenge this outrageous intrusion into press freedom in the Northern Irish courts. In June, the High Court quashed the search warrants used to search the properties and seize the electronic equipment. I was actually in the court. Sir Declan Morgan, the Lord Chief Justice of Northern Ireland, handed down a damning indictment of the police's conduct and in defence of a free press. He struck down the search warrants as unlawful. He went on to say the journalists acted in a perfectly proper manner with a view to protecting their sources in a lawful way. The court rightly stood up for the fundamental principle of press freedom and protected these journalists from a misguided attempt by the police to prevent their own embarrassment. If this warrant had been allowed to stand, it would have had a hugely chilling effect on investigative journalism across the whole country, the whole United Kingdom. A truly free press must be able to stand up to the state and the establishment without fear of reprisal. They must be able to expose uncomfortable truths and ask tough questions. This is what this case represents, but it's sadly now back in the courts. Following the quashing of the warrants, the PSNI had to be hauled back before the court again to have the journalist's property returned. Again, the court ruled in the journalist's favour and the police duly complied. But the police now insist on retaining the data taken from the phones and computers seized from the journalists. Now, so far, Mr Deputy Speaker, everything I've said is in the public domain. However, I'm precluded, as you said at the beginning, by sub judice rules from discussing the particular issues currently before the court in this case. Although it must be said, by the way, it's a judge-only hearing led by the Lord Chief Justice of Northern Ireland, so there's little risk of undue influence. Nevertheless, I will comply with the rules. Nevertheless, I will comply. Data retention by the police throughout the United Kingdom has been a long-running issue, from DNA to fingerprints, from biometric data to personal electronic data. These issues often face tensions between civil liberties, individual privacy, and the demands of the police. For example, when someone's arrested, it's commonly the case that their phone data is held long after the person is released and exonerated. We all understand a certain amount of data retention is necessary for fighting crime. But by definition, this data should be about guilty people committing crimes. As far as possible, we should avoid retaining the data of innocent people. On the rare occasions it proves necessary, it should be under the strict control of the courts and its use strictly limited. Without very good reason, data should never be kept from innocent journalists. It surely cannot be right for police to store data obtained from a warrant that's been ruled unlawful. I therefore urge the Home Office and the Northern Ireland Office to keep a close eye on the development of the Loughlin Island case, and when it's adjudicated, review the policies on data acquisition and retention for the PSNI and other police forces across the country. Because this issue is not confined to Northern Ireland. It will impact investigative journalists and whistleblowers across the whole country. Whistleblowers will see cases like this and feel intimidated that the information that they give to journalists is subject to capture and inspection by the police or other agencies of the state. Press freedom, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is at the core of our democratic system and it must be protected.
Mr. Nickard.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend joked about the latest in a series of hospital passes, but of course he is absolutely right that he is drawing to our attention tonight an extremely serious matter because of some of the core principles that it evokes, but also because it reminds us of one of the darkest and most terrible moments in that most difficult of times. And it also reminds me, listening to him, of how many times I've, in my years in this place, listened to him speaking with great passion and conviction about the importance of defending press freedom and civil rights. I don't think actually there is a more doubted champion of that in this place, and it was a pleasure to hear him speak again to that critical agenda, and I don't suppose there's any member in this House that would disagree with him about the need to protect the freedom of the press to unearth uncomfortable truths. It's at the heart of our democratic process. To some degree, I'm frustrated, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because there are real limits and limitations and challenges in responding to this from the government benches. The first, of course, flows from your very clear strictures in terms of complying with all the guidance and policies and procedures about avoiding comment upon any live legal proceedings, which is the status of this case. And my right honourable friend is experienced enough from his time in government. In fact, I'm sure he stood at this dispatch box probably in the same position at some point, and I know he will not want me to do anything to prejudice the fair and impartial conduct of the proceedings, and I'm sure other members will fully respect the judicial process and its independence. But his remarks, Mr. Deputy Speaker, have focused on the policy of the police service for Northern Ireland, on journalist data obtained under warrant, and raises both general points of principle as well as a range of specific issues. And I know that I listened very carefully to what he says, and of course that it is subject to the legal processes, but I join him, and I know the Secretary of State and others, in wanting to register on this occasion our respect and support for the police service of Northern Ireland, particularly at this most challenging of time. I could not have had a better impression of the leadership and officers that I have met. They have an incredibly difficult job to do, and we thank them for it. Of course, and I speak as a former police minister for England and Wales, that many of the wider issues raised tonight are operational issues for the police themselves to speak and respond to, and ministers must respect that independence. And while matters of general principle, of course, must be debated in this House, I would suggest that we must collectively avoid saying or doing anything that could undermine that process or undermine community confidence in policing in Northern Ireland. I want to say some things about scrutiny and accountability of the police service, given the thrust of the comments of my right honourable friend. I have some experience of accountability of police. I would say there is arguably no police service in United Kingdom or even the world that is more heavily scrutinised than the police service of Northern Ireland, and a wide, carefully considered framework of accountability exists to ensure that all aspects of policing practice are fully scrutinised. Central to that scrutiny is the locally appointed Northern Ireland Policing Board, which was this year reconstituted at the direction of the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, who's in his place alongside me, to ensure that full scrutiny of PSNI's activities could take place in the continuing and regrettable absence of a Northern Ireland executive. And my right honourable friend will be aware that the board had not, from the collapse of the devolved institutions in January 2017 to the point where the UK government took action, been able to fully fulfil its statutory functions. I'm very pleased that the Policing Board is now once again fully operational and engaged in detailed and regular scrutiny of policing in Northern Ireland, and that is taking place at a local level as is entirely appropriate. And the Policing Board, which comprises both political and non-political members, plays a crucial role in scrutiny of the PSNI, and doing so helps ensure that cross-community confidence in policing, which is so critical and which I'm sure we all want to see upheld, because it is central, of course, to the wider peace process in Northern Ireland. And I note, as I'm sure my right honourable friend knows, that both the former and current Chief Constable of PSNI have appeared on numerous occasions before the Northern Ireland Policing Board to discuss data retention, operational updates and other related issues. In responding to this debate, I don't intend to rehearse their comments, as they are a matter of public record. It is for them to comment upon these matters, although I note that they too have been studiously careful to respect the principle of sub judice where that is appropriate. I'd also, before closing, Mr. Deputy Speaker, just would like to note in this context, of course, the work of the Police Ombudsman in Northern Ireland. Having an independent, impartial Police Ombudsman is fundamental to public trust and confidence in policing and justice in Northern Ireland, which we know has been hard won and must not be undermined. The Ombudsman is an important part of providing confidence in policing through an independent mechanism for investigating police complaints in Northern Ireland, and it is essential during the course of these investigations that the Police Ombudsman is able to follow the evidential trail unfettered. And I know that it is a principle that the Police Service of Northern Ireland fully support, in line with both the letter and the spirit of the law. I also know that the Police Service of Northern Ireland will not be found wanting if areas for improvement are identified. This is a police force that places the protection of human rights at its core. It's also important to note that oversight more generally of the Police Service of Northern Ireland is not a matter for Northern Ireland Office ministers. UK government ministers maintain a close interest, of course, in the security situation in Northern Ireland, but the devolution of policing and justice in 2010 ensured that the devolved executive and the Assembly lead on this important function. In closing, Mr. Deputy Speaker, as we've heard tonight, the matters under discussion are of genuinely critical importance, because in general terms, I would note, of course, that the right to freedom of expression as reflected in Article 10 of the Convention and given further effect in the UK through the Human Rights Act 1998 is not an absolute right and does not prevent the authorities from taking legitimate and proportionate action to prevent and investigate crime. But having said that, the UK condemns strongly any attempts by governments to restrict the freedom of the media, to hold those in authority to an account, or to intimidate or detain journalists for political purposes. There is nothing that we believe in recent cases that calls into question this position by the United Kingdom. I know we can all point with pride to the efforts that the UK government is expending to build a global environment in which free and vibrant media can flourish. And as part of our leadership on this international agenda, the UK will continue to maintain the highest standards of press freedom while retaining the right to take lawful and proportionate action to prevent and investigate crime in accordance with human rights treaties and the Human Rights Act 1998. Having said that, when we do come across incidents like this, it is entirely right that they are probed and challenged and a spotlight thrown on them and the accountability mechanisms that we have around them. And I do undertake, to my right honourable friend, that we will continue to keep a close eye on this case and continue to keep it under discussion. And I again thank him for bringing this debate to the House today.
The question is, this House to now adjourn. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The ayes have it, the ayes have it. Order, order.
House of Commons sound. 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 House of Commons sound.